Thank you, Lucas. Spoiling one of my reveals later in my little story for you tonight. And thank you, Lucas, for getting my last name right. It's always very difficult, Frank. I also want to say I'm so glad I can't see anybody because it will make this a lot easier. I write books or essays or short stories in order to try to figure something out, in order to understand something. And not because I know what I'm doing, and most of the time I don't. And usually by the end, I understand a little bit of what I've done. In the case of this book that Lucas just mentioned, 100 Saturdays, I've come to see how little I truly understand about what happened to me in the process of writing the book and some of the things that happened in it. And both of these non-understandings are related to place. The first place is the Juderia of Rhodes. Rhodes, an island in the eastern Mediterranean, almost in Turkey, was the home of a storied Sephardic Jewish community that had been there since the expulsion from Spain. Born into this community was a remarkable young girl, now a woman of almost a century this May, called Stella Levy. And I sat down next to her at a lecture in Greenwich Village, place number 2, 8 years ago this February. And we struck up a conversation, and she started to tell me the story of her life, of her childhood and coming of age in this remarkable place. I went to her house the following Saturday. She told me a tiny bit more. She left me hanging. I later came to talk about her and think about her as a modern-day Scheherazade, tricky and crafty, and kept luring me back more than 100 Saturdays over 6 years. It was a lot. It is a lot. I still go. And as Lucas said, I didn't know in the beginning that I was going to write a book. I was just captivated and enchanted by this woman who brought back for me this world which had one foot in the 19th century and another in the 20th. It was a world of superstition, full of proverbs, 14,000 alone. Its own language, Judeo-Spanish, which was an offshoot of Ladino, a version of the Spanish they brought with them when they were expelled from Spain. It had its own food, music, clothes, beliefs, a cure. Stella's grandmother would put young women to bed who were nervous or neurasthenic or anxious for an entire week and empty out the houses on either side of her so there'd be total peace and quiet. When COVID hit, she said it was like a year long or 2 year long in Serradura. It was exotic, it was other, it was Sephardic, I'm Ashkenazi. There was no running water until a point. There was no showers in the house. The food was baked in a communal oven. You went to the baths on Shabbat, the eve of Shabbat, to bathe. The island was made a colony by the Italians in 1923, the year Stella was born, after they'd won it in a war, one of the wars that erupted as the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. Some modernity came in, but it still had its roots in all of this oldness and exoticism. But there was something else. The more I listened to Stella, and only retrospectively, the more I realized that there was something else happening in these blocks, 12 blocks maybe. Her uncle one day came home and said, I saw los buenos de nosotros, the best of us, the saint-like people who had been in his family, and they were 10 feet tall. He came and told his sister, Stella's mother, and she believed him. Yes, you could see people who were 10 feet tall walking along the streets of the Juderia. Time advanced. In 1938, the Italians issued their racial laws against the Jews, the fascists against the Jews. They extended as far as Rhodes. Stella was kicked out of school. Her father had to take an Italian partner at business. They couldn't go to the beach. These were beach kids. They grew up in the Malibu of the Mediterranean. They couldn't go to the cinema, the theater, the social clubs. Some of that relaxed, some of that continued. In 1943, in the fall, when Italy made peace with the Allies, Germany seized the island in a fairly easily conceded battle against the Italian militia that were there. And among the soldiers was this great friend of hers, Gennaro Tescione. And Stella had a dream about him one night. She dreamt that he was lying naked in the main piazza of the Juderia. And she woke up and told her mother, and her mother said, go light a candle in the synagogue, conveniently across the street, and you'll be better, you'll be fine. This is how they dealt with things. She came home. She didn't feel right. She went out, and she went to look for him, and she ran into his assistant, who said, oh no, Teshone has been called up to be sent to a prisoner of war camp. This was his great fear. He was a young, charismatic poet, lawyer, and swimmer. With Stella, he would swim so far out to sea that he would say, do you think we'll make it to Turkey? He defended Greeks, insurgents against the Italian government. He could not bear the idea of going to a prisoner of war camp. Stella went home. She understood. He was called up. He was packing. She still felt unwell. Ran to the synagogue again, lit another candle. It didn't do any good. She went to look for him one more time, and halfway across town, she ran into his good friend who told her that he'd shot himself. She'd had a premonition of his death in her dream. He died and left a note behind saying, salute Italy for me again when she is risen, as I know she will be. He'd given his life for honor. Incomprehensible to someone like me, I think, in today's context, but very much who this man was. He himself had had a premonition. He had visited Rhodes as a young man on a school trip and kept a diary, which I was able to read, in which he visited Rhodes, visited the Juderia, was shown around, and wrote a poem in which he said, I will be back, to die, as it turned out. A month later, her sister Renee, just older in the line of these 7 children, and not maybe the most mystically inclined of the children, had her own dream, where their grandmother was on the balcony overlooking the same piazza where Teshone had been lying naked, prefiguring his suicide in Stella's dream. And there was the grandmother, their mutual grandmother, looking down at all of the children in her family and all of the children in the neighborhood and saying, and watching them as they were being paraded and selected for a boat trip. And she said, but those are my grandchildren. Renee woke up, told the mother, lit the candle, and no one thought so much about that. This was in the fall of 43, after the Germans had seized the island. And they had, it should be said, not ghettoized the Jews, not put stars on the Jews, not really thought so much at that moment about the Jews. They were too busy trying to administer the island and deal with these Italian soldiers who had opposed them. But by July of the following year, the orders had come from Athens that the Germans, who were so late in the war that on mainland Italy, the Allies had already re-entered Rome and were on their way to entering Florence, they wanted these 1,700 Jews, mostly old people because the young men had left, and these young women and children, and they were all deported to Auschwitz, just as prefigured in Renee's dream. It was the end of that magical place, it seemed. Stella survived Auschwitz and the other 6 camps that she was sent to. She was liberated. 90% of the community died, including her parents, upon arrival. And she came to Italy for the first time. Her dream had been to be educated, to leave this small town, this small island, and see the world. And she was seeing it finally as the survivor of Auschwitz and other camps and someone who'd been liberated. She and her friends arrived first in Bologna, where they meet members of the Palestinian Brigade, which was a brigade formed of Jewish soldiers from what was then Palestine, fighting in Italy at the end of the war. And when they introduced themselves, one of her friends said her last name, which was Franco, and she said, and the soldier said, well, you're not related to Nissim Franco, are you, by any chance? It was her brother. He soon reunited with them. They went to Florence next. And one day, they decided one Saturday to go to the synagogue to see what that would feel like. They walked in, and there were 2 of their cousins who had disappeared before the war, who had gone to France and had been in hiding, who had gone to Italy when the Germans invaded France, who had been hiding in Italy, and they too had come out of hiding for the first time. They moved into a pensione, the Pensione Annalena on the Oltrarno, where they met a man called Nello Cassin, an older man who had also been in hiding during the war, and his apartment had been destroyed. He was living for a time in this pensione. A lifetime later, when Stella moved to New York and became a member of the board of the Centro Primo Levi, which had put on the lecture where she and I first met, that lecture, which was the subject of memorials. The deputy director of the institution was this man's grandson. He had never met his grandfather, but Stella had. So I accumulated these things, and I thought, I didn't know what to think, really. As I say, I couldn't understand. I thought there's something mystical, there's something mysterious about these people. Italy's a small country, Rhodes is a small island. I guess they're bound to overlap and find each other and meet each other along these strange roads of their future lives. And Stella eventually came to New York, where she moved into Greenwich Village, where I live. I met her at that lecture across the street from where I live and Lucas lives, West 12th Street. A little bit strange, a little bit villagey, a little Juderia-like, maybe not, I don't know. One day, it took time, I'll take a little parenthesis here to say, it took time for Stella to trust me with her story, as I think is probably logical now looking back. But me being the sort of eager, get my notebook out and start taking notes the minute I meet anybody interesting, started asking her a lot of frontal questions about her intimate life, about her life in the camps, about her personal life, her professional life, her knowledge of Jewish history. I mean, it was an education on every front. And I had to slow down. I had to learn that you earn trust with time and patience. And one thing that was important to Stella was that we become friends before she'd tell me the rest of her life, particularly about the camps. And I went into this whole process not knowing I was going to write a book. Then when I decided I was writing a book, I thought, well, I have to be like Janet Malcolm or Joan Didion and retain that, objective distance. I have to have my notebook as my shield always. I couldn't possibly have her to dinner. And then I woke up one morning, I thought, well, of course I have to have her to dinner because that's the only way this relationship will evolve and that this story will be told. When I gave her the address of our building on West 12th Street across from Casa Italiana, where she and I had first met and where Lucas lives, she said, oh, I lived there for 7 years in the 1970s in an apartment on the first floor, where something not very nice happened to Stella, and where 30 years later, in that very same apartment, a man was assaulted and murdered. Well, that's kind of odd, I thought. But at this point, I'd stopped thinking that all of this was so odd, I must say. Stella only returned to Rhodes in the 1970s. She was 30 years after she'd been deported, that she decided to go back to see what it was like. No Jewish family returned to the Juderia to live after the war full-time, which I think I can understand because their world was erased from one day to the next. Gone. The people were gone. What was left were the buildings. But she met this man called Ecce Ullman, charismatic, young, a Turkish art dealer, a dealer in textiles, and he said, this is nonsense. You must go. I will take you. He threw her on an airplane, he took her to the Juderia, and he helped her to face this demon of return, something for which she was very grateful, complex though it was for her to go back there. And she told me the story, and I got my pen out and my notebook and said, Ecce, okay, well, how do you spell that? He's Turkish. She said, well, I have no idea, don't remember. And I turned to Dr. Google, and with some experimentation, let's say I arrived, in fact, at Ecce Ullman, a review in the New York Times from the 1970s in which he'd mounted an exhibition of textiles belonging to a man called Pierre Apraxin, who went on to be a fairly well-known curator and writer on photography and art history. This happened on a Tuesday, and on the Wednesday, I was standing in front of my building on 12th Street where Stella lived and where Lucas lives, which is across the street from the Casa Italiana, visiting with Myra Kalman, who, having heard Stella's story a year earlier, had offered to make paintings based on photographs of this book, something that I thought was a wonderful gift to the story and to the book and to Stella and to me. And we were standing in front of the building, and she said to me, watching a man, elegant, older, thin, being wheeled by his attendant, oh, there goes Pierre Apraxin. And I'm like, okay, could you just say that one more time? There goes Pierre Apraxin. Could you spell that for me? I confirmed with my little Dr. Google search. And indeed, this was the man whose textiles her friend Ecce had shown in his gallery. He lives in my building, Myra said. And a tea was arranged with lots of cakes. If you know Myra's work, she loves a cake. And Stella and I arrived early, nervously, because for her this was another ghost being revisited. And he's wheeled in by his attendant, carrying a portrait of Ecce that had been hanging in his apartment all these years. By this point, I'm almost expecting strange, uncanny, and superstitious things to happen to me with regard to Stella, the village, the Giudiria, but nothing prepared me. For January, about 2 years ago, we're coming up upon soon International Holocaust Memorial Day, Giorno della Memoria in Italian, where in front of the Italian consulate on Park Avenue, they have this beautiful ceremony in which from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and you're all welcome to go there, they set up 6 podiums like this one with books, thick books, in which are printed the names of all of the Italian citizens who were deported to the concentration camps during World War II. Still, to my mind, quite unexplored subject in the history of the war years, particularly with the footnote of Rhodes. And they read all 10,000 names. It takes 6 hours, and people take turns going up to lecterns like this. It's entirely random. I've gone every year since I've known Stella, and in this particular year, well into my experience of her, I step up to the lectern and I look down at my book. It's not in alphabetical order, except the page is L. Okay, L. And it's Levi. And I think, Levi. Well, there are lots of Italian Levis, Primo Levi, for example, Levis all through Italy, and a number of Levis in Rhodes. Oh, I look down. These names, the first names, are names I recognize as being typical of members of the Giudiria. And then I look closer. Levi, Yehuda, Stella's father. Levi, Miriam, Stella's mother. Stella's cousin, who was murdered upon arrival because she was holding a baby. Stella's uncle, the one who'd seen Los Buenos de Nosotros. Standing in front of me are these names sitting in front of me, and I read them aloud. And I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what to make of any of this, really. In writing 100 Saturdays, I often turn to a wonderful essay by Walter Benjamin called The Storyteller. He says at some point, and I only understand about 80% of that essay, or maybe 20, depending on the day, but he says at one point, we become the stories that we tell. In some small way or large way, I think I've become part of Stella's story, and the village has become part of the Giudiria, or the Giudiria has become part of the village. It is the thing, it seems to be the thing that has survived through some uncanny, magical, and to me, incomprehensible force and way after the destruction of that beautiful place in 1944. Thank you.